All right. Well, welcome back. SOS 201. Woohoo. Professor Barry here. And now's the time we're going to dive into kind of like what is sociology, explain it, kind of give some background information, and kind of work through this lecture. So for the assignment, just as a reminder, as assignment, there's going to be different themes, usually between, I don't know, 4 to 8 themes in each lecture. For each theme, in your write-up is to talk about what the theme is, what is the general idea of the theme, so kind of give a big picture, and then provide some specific information to explain that theme. And then, as always, include the word count for each theme that you go through, and go through all the themes that are presented. Go back to the assignment. Sheet, if you want to look at that, I can't remember the word count at the top of my head. Actually, I think I got it right here. For the lecture part, 75 to 125 words for each theme. If you go over, it's all right, but just don't go too far over. All right. So let's kind of start then. It's kind of I'll try to keep these lectures, I don't know, somewhere around an hour, something like that. You can watch them, the nice thing about the themes is, if you watch the first 3 themes, you can stop, take a break for a while, come back, you can do it theme by theme, whatever. It makes it a little bit easier for you that way too, where you can break it up. Sometimes actually they'll be a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but that's kind of the goal I'm shooting for, somewhere in that ballpark of an hour or so. Okay, so the first theme, I think to get into sociology, we've got to talk about, well, what are the social sciences? So a lot of different disciplines are represented under that umbrella of the social sciences: anthropology, history, economics. Economics is actually a social science, not, we just think about it sort of the business department or math. And while there's applications in those ways, in those areas, it is a social science. Economics is trying to understand behavior, human behavior, through a very particular perspective. Geography. There's a little bit of a natural science element, but it's also social science. Cultural geography, thinking about the influence of physical geography on place and people, economy, all different kind of aspects of that. More the micro level, psychology, going from mind and brain, for example, to mind and society, social psychology, and sociology. So sociology is a field that we'll define a little bit more specifically, but a field that is trying to understand the social world, institutions and culture, all the way down to the individual or groups, more interested in groups than actual particular individuals. So what is the goal of social sciences? What's this investigation all about? And social sciences is focused on trying to understand the human experience. And to understand the human experience, we need to understand history. Things that are going on from either a neuropsych level or human behavior level, thinking about culture and place, anthropology, thinking about physical place, thinking about, all these different aspects are really about trying to understand the human experience. And we need to study society to understand the human experience. So as a gendered individual, we all have gender identity. We all have ideas about gender that we've assimilated from within culture. Our social position influences our ideas about gender. So to understand the human experience, we have to understand all those factors of maybe the more obvious with gender would be culture and history, but also economics plays a role. I never really thought about geography. I imagine there's probably applications that you could make in there as well. So then why do we study, the human experience? What's the value in that? Part of it's just intellectual curiosity or personal curiosity. Humans are curious creatures and we want to know. So it's just exploring to understand. Part of that's a byproduct of the Enlightenment or the age of reason, the development of science and the scientific model. Another reason to study the human experience is that if we understand the past, we can better understand the present. The past repeats itself, right? And so if we understand the past, we can be in a better position to understand the present and to understand ourselves in the present, and then be able to ultimately maybe put together policies that are more, that don't fall into some of the traps that policies fell to in the past. And then finally, we study the human experience so that we can address social issues, social problems, and provide solutions. So if we see places of struggle or challenge within human communities or within society, the more that we understand that we're in a better position to be able to make change that's productive, meaningful, valuable change. Part of this is related to democracy, the rise of democracy and the democratic ideals. Part of it, social sciences really expanded in the 1800s. Academia expanded in significant ways in the 1800s. And part of that was there was industrialization and the consequences of industrialization. Urbanization, more people were moving to urban settings, so it created an environment where more social issues became more prevalent, a breakdown of sort of the ways of communities were organized before. Now they're more impersonal, the more dense populations, more secular society. Like there's a lot of changes that are going on that led to the expansion of trying to understand the human experience so that we can be in a better position to address some of the problems that are going on. So here's some different examples thinking about, maybe the value of thinking about the social sciences. We could look at things like, this is the year, expected years of schooling by nation over, 27-year time period, going back 1990 to 2017. Nothing really to want to, to bring out here other than to say that the world's changing, right? And we know that, and this is changing in significant ways. I mean, this kind of new economic world that we are in, the levels of education required to participate in this economic world. And then we also can look at this chart and look, not everybody has that same access to years of education. So we start to ask questions about that. It helps us to better understand our own privileged place that we are in the United States and developed countries, having access and resources to engage in education in that way. Another way, sort of, maybe another example of the value of understanding or understanding the human experience and how history can be important, and also thinking about where humans are located, the distributions of humans, in a community, and specifically thinking about rural versus urban and sort of transitions that have been going on for a long time. That in early years in North America and in what has become the United States, or 1770s. So, well, what is the United States? 1790, 95% of people lived in agricultural-based communities. Totally different way of social organization than where we're at today. In an urban environment, we're almost not quite flip-flop yet. But 86% of people live in urban environments today. Major shift, transition over a course of a long time period. But it's trying to understand that those changes going on is helping to understand communities, understand the human experience through that perspective. And then just look at the size of the population, right? 4 million people, 4 million people, and now we are at, I think this is not including certain segments of the population, 330, somewhere in there, 330 to 370 million people in the United States today. So it's a different thing, a different nut to crack, right? Of trying to figure out how do we ensure society stability, organization, in an environment of that's really complex, not only in terms of the number of people, but also in terms of the diverse backgrounds of individuals as well. We can bring that a little bit closer to home. We could look at within Deschutes County and see some of this change, which is really interesting. Some of the estimates before expansion, before colonization of the West, that the indigenous population in Oregon country was somewhere around 50,000. 1903, the population has been to 2003. 1950, 22,000. The mill at Shevlin-Hickson Mill ends operation in 1960s. This is down in Sun River, Camp Abbott. And, Ski Lodge opens, Bachelor Butte, not Butter, opens up, and COCC starts on Aubrey Butte. 1980, 1998, 2021, 200,000 people. So if you've lived in Central Oregon for a period of time, you notice this transition that's going on. People coming in, we have all kinds of challenges that are going on because of that, housing, among other challenges. So it's the more we can understand a lot of these things, the more we can understand, the human experience in our communities, and then understand how to potentially make change. I don't want to go through these videos, but if you have time, open up the lecture video. You can click on these. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. That I think the illustration here is that with urbanization in the early 1900s, 1800s, early 1900s, the industries were not very well regulated. There wasn't a lot of regulations on industry. So the workers were in brutal conditions, workplace conditions, where there's no protections for workers. And it led to a lot of different problems and issues. And one of them that was really a catalyst for unionization in the United States was unionizing employees, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a factory fire that happened. I can't remember the number of people who died in that factory fire in New York City. But it just a call and attention that had been going on for a long time, that workers need protection from industry, that there needs to be a checks and balances put in place. Thinking about it, this little icon here, Boston Police Department, the first police department in the United States, 1854. So, okay, it's like interesting, right? So societies are developing and changing. New institutions are needed, even things like public parks, and the role that public parks play in communities and people's lives. Now, just a little bit more information. This is just some data and information about this sort of that rapid change to an industrial society, migration, movement of people, number of kids who are working, the number of hours that they're working per week is pretty amazing, isn't it? Kids are working 50 to 70 hours a week during that particular time period. And what became shaped the public's ideas about child labor was people started documenting what was going on in terms of some of the abuses that were going on within industries, the conditions that kids were working in. And it took a long time for change to be made, but finally, it did. And part of it was because the public became more aware of what was going on within these factories. Most of the kids came from poor working class families, poor families. So the middle class wasn't something their kids experienced. So the more information, the more images that got shared, the more that people in the middle class became aware of these kind of problems and issues, and change eventually came. So Louis Hine was one of the, he's usually the photos you see of child labor in this time period came from Louis Hine. He was a sociologist, and he photojournalism, documentation as a way to bring about social change. Things like, okay, so if we're not having kids working in factories, then we get sort of, universal education. So we get compulsory education, laws around that. Mass urbanization, mass industrialization. What happens when kids are not, in a agricultural community, kids are going to be, for the most part, they're going to be part of a family structure. Industrial urban society, where you have, the amount of hours that people are working, the economic struggle going on. There's kids living on, kids are going to be, kids are disattached from homes or living on streets. There's all kinds of social problems. The start of our foster care system goes back to this time period where Charles Loring Brace from the Children's Aid Society starts a project to basically take kids from the inner city that are not attached to a family, put them on a train, send them out to the Midwest to work on farms. The idea is that being in a agricultural community is a more moral place than being in the city. Here they could learn skills and trades and abilities and help them become, productive citizens, that kind of thing. So programs have started. Institutions start to develop in responding to human need. Jane Addams, and this is a picture of the Hull House in Chicago. It was a place of, in Chicago, near the University of Chicago, with a lot of immigration, a lot of immigrants, a lot of working class people, a lot of struggle going on in that community. And the Hull House was a place to integrate, to provide resources, support, and housing for individuals who are trying to make it in Chicago. And it also became a place for students from the University of Chicago to work at the Hull House to better understand that group and that population. And we'll probably talk more about the Hull House later on. And then finally, I guess some key takeaways. understand the past, understand the present. We live and interact in communities. So the more that we're aware of them, the more we can take responsibility and develop a sense of civic responsibility for them. The more we become self-empowered, community empowered as well. And if we don't try to understand something, we're more prone to just repeating the past. Okay, so that's kind of the social sciences, a lot of information, but hopefully kind of give you sort of a general orientation or framework thinking about the value of the social sciences and what they are. Okay, second, let's go into now is like thinking about the relationship between the individual and society or social forces. And this is going to be something that we work on throughout the course of the term. And in part because our culture and our cultural value puts a lot of focus on individual level explanations, where we have a hard time addressing, understanding, and engaging in thinking about the structural influences on the individual experience. So we have cultural ideas thinking that poverty is generated by a lack of motivation, for example, that people just aren't properly motivated or not working hard enough, or they got some problems in their life. They're just not doing the things they need to do to dedicate themselves to moving themselves out of poverty. And that's very, very entrenched individual way of thinking. It's always about some interaction between the individual and social forces. So this is what we're going to be talking about in this particular, in this theme. So when I think about social forces, we're thinking about anything outside the self. Durkheim, our functionalist theorist, talked about social facts, things that are external to the self that shape the self. Something that we may see as very personal, something like suicide rates. Durkheim examined suicide, and he brought to the public's attention that we have to move away from thinking about it as an individual only experience and start thinking about the social context, environment, and think about structural factors. And what he found out, and this is still true today, that individuals that are more well integrated within community and society are less likely to commit suicide. So for example, divorce versus married, the rates of suicide are different. The more people who are married are much less likely to commit suicide because they are integrated with another, they have a partner, support system, they're integrated into a system. And this helps us, I think, as an example to start to go, okay, it's more than just about the individual. The individual is interacting in an environment. So we got to understand what's the interplay between individuals and the environment itself. So it could be history, it could be culture, it could be status or position, class position, race, gender, other parts of who we are, technology influencing the human experience, our physical environment. I mean, you can go on and on thinking about all the different potential influences on the human experience. And there's different ways of understanding the individual and social forces. The first one is this idea of like common sense. Well, it's just common sense, right? That males are just better at math. So there's like a idea that is circulated within culture. But there's limitations to that. I mean, is it being male? There's, the evidence, it's not a gendered aspect. In reality, you may see math scores higher for males than females, SAT, ACT scores higher for males than females. But that's not a biological essential part of male. That's about socialization and culture having a significant influence on the development of those aptitudes. So it's the environment shaping that. So common sense sometimes is very problematic because what we believe to be true may actually be a more complicated story behind that. Another way of approaching understanding the relationship is to engage in more critical thinking, to really take those ideas that maybe we become common knowledge and start to ask questions about them, and to engage in it more thoroughly and critically, to be more aware. Another way of and that's, I guess, one last comment here about that is to engage in critical thinking. We have to suspend our own biases, judgments about the way the those we believe that they should be or the way that they are, right? So a lot of cultural imprinting shapes the way that we think, and sometimes those cultural filters prevent us from more objectively looking at things that are going on. So it's being able to suspend those cultural filters, and that's hard because we have to be aware that those filters are actually shaping the way we view things. Another way of understanding it is empirical. This relationship between individual and social is looking at empirical data, information, stuff that's generated out of science, investigation. We get more objective levels of understanding. Here's quotation marks here. We're too soft on criminals. That's why we have a crime problem. It's just like with kids. If you don't give enough consequences, they'll do bad things. That's like this common sense or an ideology, a cultural notion and belief, but it's not. It's an inaccurate explanation for crime. It divorces. It puts it all on the individual and moves it totally away from thinking about a variety of social structural forces. And the challenge becomes one, you can still hold individuals accountable, but also understand the interplay between individuals and the environment. So it's never about excusing behavior. It's about trying to understand behavior. And to understand behavior, we have to look at that interaction between individuals and society itself. Sometimes the empirical can contradict our own common sense. Sometimes empiricism challenges the status quo, challenges the order. And sometimes there's a move to delegitimize or to basically call science bad science, and sometimes, science maybe should be critiqued for sure. Anything should be critiqued, but sometimes it's indiscriminatory, just blanket delegitimizing empiricism and science is a way to protect the status quo. To protect the way things are. And it's a lack that, to me, it just demonstrates a lack of engagement of trying to understand. And part of this, an example may be research on income inequality and teenage pregnancy. There's a strong correlation, not a causation, between the degree of inequality and teenage pregnancy. That's going to be hard for some people to kind of go to start thinking about the structural influence of inequality and thinking about that impact of inequality on teenage pregnancy. There's a connection going on there, but there's still individual teenagers making decisions, but in a context. And that's sort of the idea that we're after. So one way of thinking about this, another way to think about this is free will is the individual, like individual making choices independent of influence of the context. So we all have, this is the idea that we all have free will. It's ultimately individual accountability, responsibility, or the individual may be exposed to different environmental influences, but it's the individual making that choice, right? Determinism is on the other end of the continuum. Basically, we talk about either biological determinism or social determinism. That biological determinism, that people are the way that they are because it's biologically determined, or social determinism, it's the social environment, the context that's determining the behavior. I will argue or provide a perspective that neither end of those continuums are correct. That it's too extreme. The reality is that that individuals are self-determined. It's the individual making decisions within a context. Okay, individuals making a decision within a context. Now we can break that down further and go, okay, it's individuals, but sometimes it matters the status of the individual, right? So your class position, gender, and race provide different opportunities, different consequences, different support systems, different realities that people live in based on their status position. So it's about individual within context making choices. That's self-determinism. So we're looking at from the individual, we're looking at the interplay between the individual and all these other, from micro level all the way to the macro level influences. One way to think about this is Matthew Novak, psychology professor on campus, talks with students about the egg yolk versus the egg white. They're interrelated. I like this this visual because the egg yolk could be free will. The white is determinism, the social forces, and those two are interrelated. So it's thinking about in the situation, for example, of crime, and we go back here, teenage pregnancy. How big is the egg yolk and how big is the egg white? To me, that's a more valuable question than to put it all on, for example, all on free will, which would be the case here, right? That's just oversimplifying a more complicated issue of human behavior. It's the ability to engage in thinking about the relationship between individuals and society. Different examples, you can kind of go here. This is Sandra Day O'Connor, 1983, I think. She became the first female to occupy the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. So clearly it makes individuals within context, right? Women and really gender stratification is an important thing to understand. So we don't just say that's just free will, right? Well, it's that divorces some examination of the context. John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960. He was the first non-Protestant to occupy the Oval Office. So he's Catholic, and that was a huge thing, right? It's hard to understand that today, but that was a huge thing. Airline stewardesses, you can kind of look through here, the requirements to be an airline stewardess back in the 1950s, 1960s, and it changed by the 1970s, but there's age requirements. You had to be single, weight requirements, you had to be attractive. I mean, all these different kind of things, right? They fit the culture of the particular time period. But this picture here is of an ice climber. And I just sort of think about, I wondered, I couldn't find data on it, but looking at, I think social background makes a difference, right? If you're going to be engaged in ice climbing, it makes sense you've lived in an environment, a social environment that support developing the skills and the abilities and the opportunities to engage in ice climbing. So I think there's going to be racial demographics that are probably, it's going to be probably middle class, upper middle class, white ice climbers, at least in the United States, probably in other places as well. So yeah, it's the individual within context, right? Okay, so I don't know, we can talk about this in class, but I don't want to take, I just want to be sensitive to time here. Got a lot of slides to go through. We can think about mass shootings as being one. You can kind of read through this, but I think, in some ways when a mass shooting happens, there's a sort of debate going on, right? Or one position is that it's individuals, it's just the individual, right? It's the bad individual without any examination of maybe the sick society. Like, what's the relationship between the individual and society itself? And we have to be able to do that in order to better understand and then to be in a position to actually make change. Now, the challenge becomes one is the more you try to go back, the more we try to systematically understand the social, cultural, structural forces of mass shootings, for example, more it's going to push up against some cultural ideas and beliefs about things. It's going to push up against, there's political interests that are served. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are going on that are shaping what we think and what we hear in the debate about mass shootings. I think to understand mass shootings, we have to understand gender socialization as an important part, right? I mean, if mass shootings are coming from, it's a gendered experience. Males are primarily the mass shooters. So what's going on in terms of gender socialization in society that's shaping that? That is an important part if you're trying to understand, some of the factors that are shaping mass shootings. So this is going to challenge, for some, it's going to be a big challenge because either they haven't thought about the influence of gender socialization, or they may interpret it that's excusing the mass shooting. And I would say it's about trying to understand so that we can be in a better position to address some of the causes. Okay, so another way to think about it, I think I came up with this idea, or I've heard, the fish like a fish out of water. So I kind of ran with it and started thinking, okay, the free will is like, okay, here's let's say a bowl of fish and they're in poverty, right? And one fish makes it out. Well, it's like, and so sometimes we use that as an example. Well, if that fish made it out, then all the other fish can make it out too. So it's this very free will kind of perspective. Well, one made it out, but there's a relationship between the individual and society itself. So did the fish make it out because it worked harder, tried harder than others? What about, the social environment in which learning happened, the reinforcement, the support systems, the opportunities, the modeling that went on? So working hard, it's not, sure, the individual worked hard, but there's a context around that as well. To state that the individual motivation alone, I think that lacks objectivity and imagination. So it's not only the individual, it's the individual within a context. And by doing the individual alone, it reinforces a system that protects privilege and advantage, or reinforces disadvantage. I would say there's probably different bowls for different types of fish. There's different water for different fish, different peers, different interactions, different proximity between the two different bowls, different nutrition in the water. The one that makes it out may be the token. They made it out, therefore everybody else can too. And I think that just kind of reinforces this sort of very individualistic perspective. All right, so now let's kind of move into, and we're going to spend a lot of time throughout the course of the term just kind of trying to tease that out, the individual, the context, and we're going to probably be examining a lot the social determinants and social influences. Okay, what is sociology, sociological imagination? Just a couple different examples here. Lab-grown insect meat. Could that be the future of food production? High protein. Would that be something that we move to? That we're even engaged in that discussion is kind of interesting. So we got to do, I don't know, just something to, think interesting example, food, the food that we eat, why we eat the food that we eat is a fascinating kind of story about history, culture, geography and things like that. Technology as well. Think about Oregon. Why is Oregon white? And part of it, understanding race and policies, racism that is embedded in social policies going back to the 1800s, Oregon Territory and on. I mean, part of understanding the present is understanding the past. Sociology defined as sociology as a systematic study of society. We're looking at the interrelationship between individual and society. Examine the context, historical, cultural, social, economic context. The goal is basically to understand and to, if need be, to make some change. Provide the example of the criminal justice system or incarceration system, the prison system. The United States, we incarcerate more than anyone else in terms of country in the world. That's pretty powerful, and it's not even close. We are by far the greatest incarcerator of any country in the world. Well, I think it begs the question, like, well, why? How did it come to be that way? What's the history behind that? And then also think about, if we don't I think the importance of trying to understand that is to understand, well, to evaluate whether or not that system is one that's working well for us as a nation, as a people, whether or not that's good for, that model is one that's effective for, for society, stability of society itself. So to understand the present, we got to deal with the past, to understand culture, all these different kind of influences. And again, to go back to this, is it can provide us, by understanding, it can put us in a position that we can provide better ideas about how to social engineer or design systems that are more effective. We're not going to watch this video right now, but I encourage you to. It's just a real interesting. Eastern State Penitentiary was the first penitentiary in the United States. It's outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Liberty Hall is in Philadelphia, where the Liberty Bell is. And dignitaries from around the world would come to Philadelphia in the 1700s. I can't remember when Eastern State, it had been the 1800s actually. But more people dignitaries from around the world would want to see Eastern State Penitentiary than they would, Liberty Hall, where the Constitution was signed and the Declaration of Independence. And the Eastern State Pen, I think, occupied a lot of attention because it's the first time there's this sort of model of a penitentiary system. People have been incarcerated, humans, or incarcerated, people have been held in captivity for long, for thousands of years. But now it's like institutionalizing for the first time a penitentiary system. So, okay, well, let's think about, for our prison system, are we focused on retribution, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and just neglect, like I don't care, and so sort of malign or bad neglect versus rehabilitation? What's our model? What's the goal? What's the focus of the model? There's inequalities that are existing in our criminal justice system, race, class, gender. There's a cost factor to incarcerate someone at the state, federal system. The cost varies, but it's expensive to do. There's a viewpoint that our prison system is a place for politicians to exert a position. There's political gain. There's political capital that's gained. Sometimes our approaches to addressing crime and criminality is a scapegoat, or it's a way to remove from discussion other structural inequalities. There's the increase starting in the 1980s, 1990s, privatization of prisons. These are things that are important to become aware of so we can be in a better position to make decisions collectively about what serves the best interest of everyone. So understanding is important. Part of sociology is that ability to systematically understand so we can be in a better position to challenge the order and to advocate for change as need be. C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination is kind of a key way of thinking about sociology. C. Wright Mills, a couple different takeaways I think that identified here is that personal biography and history are linked. So an individual's biography, their lived experience, is connected with history and culture. So this is that self-determination thing, free will versus determinism. This is that self-determination. Part of investigating the social world is to better understand oneself, the groups that one belongs to. And so biography and history are linked. The more you understand the social world, the more you understand yourself and others. Then Mills gets into talking about private troubles and public issues. The example he uses is that if there's 10,000 people, if a person is unemployed, they've lost their job, it's a private trouble. If 10,000 people lose their job, it's a public issue. It's no longer just a private trouble, right? So that draws our attention to that structural side of things and look at the structural conditions that are shaping the human experience. And that's the sociological imagination, is moving away from our individual only explanation to engage in thinking about other things that are outside, that are much more macro level in influence. And to do that, we have to remove our blinders, our filters, and evaluate things and look at things a little bit more objectively. By understanding the influence of society, we humanize ourselves and others. I can talk about, an example, thinking about white privilege as a white person. I have had advantage in my life in terms of my racial, in terms of being white. Because, even though there's racial privilege, it doesn't remove from my experience the accomplishments that I've made. It puts them in perspective. It puts my experiences in perspective. So it puts myself in a context. It facilitates understanding how one's racial identity shapes their experience in the world itself. And for myself, not only does understand, my advantage, the advantages or my experience of being a white person in the world, but then I can sort of start to engage and start thinking about individuals of color and how our experiences may be different. In some ways, that helps to humanize, all of us by engaging in that. That also helps put me in check a little bit and to try to minimize the number of irrational judgments and biases that I bring into understanding myself and other. So it's empowering. To me, it never detracts, like thinking about myself in terms of, the white privilege doesn't take away from my own particular accomplishments, but it puts them in perspective. And that to me is empowering versus disempowering. I don't know, the old mill, we're not going to go here. I just, just for the lack of time, this is a cool little video just about the operation of mills in Central Oregon and historical perspective on the mill. So, Central Oregon, we're transformed from the old mill to old mill shopping and development. So, different kind of Central Oregon, different place to be, right? There's a lot of focus, discussion about understanding, why Oregon is a high percentage of Oregonians are white. Part of this goes back to policies that were in the 1800s that shaped the development, the migration of peoples to Oregon. Here's another interesting example for me of sort of the sociological imagination. Think about our occupational choices. That about 96% of dental hygienists are female. It's like, wow, that's a lot. Like, what's going on? Using the sociological imagination, biography and context are interrelated. So thinking about that self-determination, think about patterns of human behavior. It's like fascinating, right? So think about, these are high-paying occupations with their professional, a lot of autonomy, and yet 96% of those who move into dental hygiene are female. What's going on, right? That's kind of the sociological imagination thing is, what's going on? To try to explain that. Yeah, so here's female CEOs, the number of CEOs, top Fortune 500 companies in the United States. And what year was this? This was in the last 4 or 5 years. And, it's like there's some gender disparity going on there. It's trying to understand that. We can kind of get into all kinds of different things too, but just different examples. Think about the unionization of, the number of unionized employees in the United States versus different countries. Thinking about patterns of things like this. Think about, white supremacy in the United States. This is the KKK, a march in Washington back in the 1900s, I think it was 1930s, lining the streets, the KKK marching in the streets, thinking about white nationalism. To understand today, we've got to go back into the past. Think about things that charter schools have an interesting history. Charter schools and private schools, part of it, there's civil rights issues. There's part of issues of equity that kind of get brought into that. Part of the rise and development of charter schools in response to, part of race, when Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when public institutions were desegregated, there became a move to privatization of schools and charter school development. So there's a lot of stuff, right? And sociological imagination is to engage in that social world to better understand the social world, and so that ultimately to be more self and community empowered. Okay, number 4, some general concepts. So the theme here is just really some general concepts, ways of thinking about things sociologically. So general in the particular is we're looking at patterns of behavior. So the particular is the individual, and the general is looking for patterns. And that's the focus on social sciences. Some disciplines maybe more than others, but really, not interested in the individual, but interested in the patterns among individuals, the general and the particular. And then the strange and the familiar is the taken for granted world, the day-to-day life is the familiar, and it's to see the strange, the novelty in the familiar. So let me provide a couple different examples of that. So the patterns of behavior, patterns of things, right? A number of craft breweries in the United States, look at the distribution, that's looking for patterns, right? This is drug overdose by state. So there's a pattern. So once we identify the pattern, then we think about, well, why does that pattern exist? And breaking down the pattern. So that's the general and the particular of the idea. Strange and the familiar is taking what's, taken for granted, the common everyday life, the stuff that we did, it's just so common that we don't ask questions about it. It just becomes normalized. And it's seeing the novelty or the strangeness in it. So this is an ad in the 1950s, 1960s, where actually there were doctors that were advocating for supporting smoking certain brands of cigarettes versus others. And the tobacco industry was enlisting and paying, doctors to give their support. And the reason that tobacco companies are doing this is because science at that time was starting to indicate that smoking tobacco is actually harmful to one's health, and it could cause cancer. So the response from R.J. Reynolds and other tobacco companies would start to do these ads where, doctors are saying smoke this brand of cigarette versus another. This is 1970s, maybe 1980s. I think it's interesting. Blow on her face and she'll follow you anywhere. During that time period, people probably thought, ooh, that's pretty sexy and cool. And, so people didn't go, well, think about how at the time period, it's hard to think about how strange that is, right? It's so familiar to us that we don't ask questions about it. If you saw this ad in the 1950s, wouldn't have thought too much about it, doctors advocating for smoking certain brands of cigarettes versus others. It's just coming through your landscape. You're not stopping to think about it, right? Joe Camel, right here on the far right, got in some trouble because the allegation was, and it was established in court, and they had to change their ad campaign because the prevailing argument was that R.J. Reynolds was using this character of Joe Camel to appeal to kids. You get kids smoking early, you create lifelong customers, kind of thing. So the idea is strange and familiar, is common everyday stuff. Usually we're not, because it's common every day, we don't stop and ask questions about it. But it's to see the strange in the familiar, to better understand that these things are really unique and odd, interesting, day-to-day life stuff. Years ago, there was a campaign to draw awareness to breast cancer. And it was like the I Love Boobie campaign. This was probably, 15 years ago, where it really took off. And I was like, wow, this is super interesting. Our kids were in school at the time, or middle school. And, they're talking about, they're wearing bracelets, I love boobies. Like, okay, this is well beyond drawing awareness to breast cancer. There's all kinds of stuff going on about masculinity wrapped up in this. And it's not, I love breasts, I love boobies. It's just really, there's cultural things that are going on there, and then culture and also gender stuff that's happening within that too. There's also testicular cancer, but, wearing a bracelet, I love balls. I'm not sure about, never seen any of those bracelets. I'm not sure. Is it a number factor? Just the number of people are impacted? I think there's other things going on within that as well. This is, I was walking in Costco one day and I saw this, food advertising is interesting because it presents this image of a very pastoral past, sort of this agrarian kind of way of life, clean and pure kind of thing. I saw this like milk carton and I'm like, okay, there's a chicken, a couple of farm animals. That's it, right? I'm like, I can guarantee you the cows where this milk came from, that farm did not look like that. So the world of images that we're around, it's like just kind of trying to critique them, understand them. This is in San Francisco. This is like, prevent the homeless from sitting or people from sitting, but it's really directed towards people without a home. This is in Canada. This is, if it was another country, we'd have to tell you that this is coffee may be hot. Good thing is it's Canada. Like things like our packaging is, comes from somewhere, right? So what's the story? What's the story behind where stuff comes from? The Olympics just happened. Some discussion about, what female beach volleyball players were wearing. And it's part of like seeing the strange and the familiar is to, things that this may be more obvious, but to stop to ask questions about those kind of things. And then let's see, I got maybe one more, kind of walk through these theories. We'll spend more time in the theories in class. We'll kind of walk through the general ideas of the three theories. We won't spend a lot of time, we'll spend more time in class talking about them. So basically there are three theories that we'll explore. There's many more branches of theories. There's branches underneath each of these. Our job is really, or our goal is to get an orientation of what these three branches are. And then maybe if you continue on in sociology, you'll see there's more variations in the theme. We're just kind of get the general lay of the land, these three theories. Functionalism, think about it as society as an ecosystem, a biological organism. Conflict theory, basically sort of start thinking about distribution of power, equity, inequality. Ultimately, the goal of conflict theory is to understand, to advance more equity. And then interactionism is language, meaning, perspective. I mean, this is all language, right? Lipstick wham, Russian red, lady danger. There's all, language and gender are part of that. This is a great video to get an overview of those three theories. Encourage you to watch this video, open up the PowerPoint, click on that to get an overview of the theories. There's a lot of other videos out there online too that will give you background on the theories. Kind of real fast going through functionalism. Think about society as a biological organism. Society is a problem-solving entity. If I were to go way back to here, right? So orphan trains developed, compulsory education laws developed in response to problems that were going on in society itself. So the viewpoint of a functionalist perspective is that society is a problem-solving entity. So a problem arises, then there's a work to, if the problem gets significant enough where it's challenging the system's trying to correct for it or address that particular problem. Society has a lot of different parts, a lot of different institutions. So you think about criminal justice, healthcare, education, the economy, the government. I mean, all these different parts that are interrelated. They're all working. They all impact each other. So it's this complicated ecosystem approach. There's an idea from a functionalist viewpoint that a value consensus. So democratic ideals, our democracy, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution is an expression of our value consensus, the values that we share. Societies operate more effectively, more stable when there's a shared consensus of values. There's a focus on functionalism, of examining the degree of integration to integrating people within society and communities, and also the regulation of behavior itself. So part of understanding things like crime, for example, certain types of crime may be higher when there's less social integration of people into communities. So think about youth, for example. Certain youth who are not integrated into conventional society may be more likely to commit certain types of crime. So we have the integration viewpoint, and then we have the regulation. When people commit crime, what's the regulatory aspect of the state or the community to regulate behavior to create stability? Anomie is sudden change. When change happens, it's too fast, too sudden. It makes it difficult for the system. The idea, the view of social dysfunctions is if there's a dysfunction, society works to correct that dysfunction. If the dysfunction is dysfunctional enough, if it's causing disruption. The view of social change from a functionalist perspective, slow, gradual change to the system. And that becomes key when we start making a comparison to conflict theory. Here's suicide rates. This is an issue of integration. Kind of already talked about that a little bit. We can also look at suicide rates based on, think about the general and the particular here, right? Looking at patterns of behavior. Thinking about, well, for which groups, racial groups, are suicide rates higher? This is an issue of integration where, and also economic dislocation, struggle. There's social forces that are going on that are shaping those particular outcomes. Gangs, this is just sort of an image of a gang. Gangs are a functional adaptation to a dysfunction in the environment. So one way to think about gangs is people are seeking in a community where they've been disengaged, where they've been disenfranchised from the larger social world. They form their own social community in order to become integrated, have a sense of position, of value and belonging. So that's kind of one thing that maybe gangs and sports have some similar functions that are going on within them. You know, our value consensus as a nation, changing, moving, trying to establish what are our values, what are our principles, what are our positions that we're taking on things like racial equity and understanding race in society itself. So it's about, you know, it's just, you know, our values are never, they're always, they're moving and sometimes moving faster and changing faster in certain time periods than others. But there's sometimes, yeah. So anyway, enough said there. That value consensus, you know, we have very diverse social world, a lot of different religions, and it's figuring out how to integrate that complexity into modern day world. Sebastian Junger, this book called Tribe, really interesting book about basically about understand a lot of stuff on integration. He doesn't talk about those words in sociology specifically, but it's really about the importance of tribe, in terms of our own mental health, our sense of being, and our place within community itself. It's a lot of functionalist kind of ways of thinking. Conflict theory, different perspective, right? These are different perspectives, and one way to approach this, think about it, is that there's these three different theories or different views, different perspectives grounded in research, supported by research. They're different lenses from which to view the world. Okay, so I think they give you analytical tools so you can look at things from a functionalist viewpoint, conflict theory viewpoint, interactionist viewpoint. And then I think the next step is like, who has the best case, the strongest case to when looking at a particular issue. So looking at, for example, our prison system, looking at it from a functionalist viewpoint, conflict theory viewpoint, interactionist viewpoint, all three of them give you different things to think about. All three of them have value. One theory may have a stronger argument and a case to be made for understanding that particular system. So I think for me, that's like one approach to thinking about these theories. So conflict theory, let's not talk about this term right now. Well, okay, real quick. So materialism is our economic structure. So capitalism is our economic structure. What Marx was interested in, Karl Marx was interested in, is economic structures, how they change across time, and the impact of economic structure. So an agricultural-based society that's the material structure of agricultural base is agriculture. Industrial capitalism, that's the material base, industrial capitalism. That's historical change in economic systems. And what Marx was interested in is what's the influence of the economic system on society and people. In a system of capitalism, you have the bourgeoisie, the owners, the ruling class, and the proletariat, the workers. There's also the lumpen proletariat. There's other groups that Marx identified, but the two main groups are the workers, the proletariat, versus the owners, the bourgeoisie. And from a Marxist model or conflict theory model, the bourgeoisie, the owners, shape institutions for their own benefit at the consequence of the working class. Rather than a value consensus, for the functionalist viewpoint, society is a value consensus. Conflict theory sees that society is structured in this kind of a system, that's value coercion. The powerful are shaping the values and institutions of life, and the general public doesn't have the ability to, or the general public is at the mercy of, to a larger degree, of that of the bourgeoisie or the owners. There's this issue of false consciousness, that the general public becomes falsely aware of their social and class position, and they align their beliefs, start to get aligned with the ideas of the ruling class. And the idea from a conflict theory perspective, Marxist perspective, was, this is part of the Communist Manifesto, is try to get people educated, informed, develop class consciousness so they can get organized, develop a way to revolt against the system to create change. The model ultimately, so that's kind of like, I don't know, conflict theory, Marxism is a huge body of knowledge and thought. That's the general structure, the general idea. Academics today are neither functionalist in orientation, they're neo-functionalist, like new functionalist, or neo-Marxist, is sort of new Marxist. So it's taking the ideas of like either Durkheim or Marx, and then reworking them in a way to be more consistent with the reality of the world that we live in today. Conflict theory is a social justice, has much more of a focus on ensuring the democratic principles of and our constitutional protections are there for everyone. So there's a model of social justice, of addressing race, class, gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, other parts of our lived experience, of examining these to be able to create change, to move towards greater justice. For social change, for a functionalist, right, was slow, gradual change. For a conflict theory perspective, it's radical restructure. So for example, the healthcare system, a kind of a functionalist viewpoint to bring about change in healthcare reform, even the language, right? Reform, slow, gradual change within the existing institutions. From a conflict theory's perspective, it raises the question of radical restructure is needed. So have a government-run healthcare program, more independent from insurance companies, because there's a lot of power, right? A lot of money in that system. So that may be something that's a radical restructure. Is putting healthcare in the operation of the public. It's a public good versus a private enterprise. Of course, this is going to get us into all kinds of things that are going to be very contentious. But to me, it's like, well, how do we understand that interplay? How do we make sure that our cultural blinders are not, unduly, just sort of shaping how we view these issues. So we come to our analysis built on more awareness and information and critique. Different examples, maybe talk about these later on. Let's talk about this one right here, like, monuments to the Confederacy. A lot of monuments there were two different waves of monument building. One of them was in the 1950s. And this was in response, in large part, to the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s. So who controls culture sometimes is an issue of power. And there's a lot of conflict theory stuff in that. The United States is the only industrialized country that does not have required paid leave, paid sick leave, maternity, family leave. We're the only industrialized country that does not have required mandated paid family leave. And so, like, what's going on there? Like, how do we understand that? We have to get into our history, our culture, our values. Seattle kind of recently moved to actually doing it within their own city. It's going to be an interesting sort of comparison eventually, where we have the data and information to look at sort of the impact of universal paid and medical leave within that particular city. So conflict theory perspective, I think, sort of look at, well, whose interests are being served and protected by this particular model. I think it raises questions about, the bourgeoisie gaining advantage within that particular system. Issues like voter suppression and what's gone on, recent years, but you got to go back to the past, looking at a long history of voter disenfranchisement, and that's about political power and control. Criminal justice system, a lot of data, empirical evidence identifying that degrees of inequality matter. The greater inequality within a nation, the greater likelihood of certain types of crime within those communities. So crime policy measures is addressing inequality. That's going to do that though, we have to challenge, there's going to be a challenge to power and the distribution of resources. So, in some ways, to change that system, people have to become class aware or become aware of that link between inequality and crime and move away from blaming the individual, for example, and move to understanding, well, how do we redistribute resources to make it more equitable and also to deal with these particular social challenges and social problems that we have. Then we can kind of get Weber theory. So Weber and symbolic interactionism, a little bit different, but there is some relationship. Weber gets us into thinking about rationalization, modernization, the development of bureaucracies. So he's going to be our theorist where we go to start thinking about rationality, science, the Enlightenment, the rise of bureaucratic order, rules, structure. He kind of talked about that rationality can become an iron cage where we get trapped in the systems of rationality and they're very dehumanizing. And the world becomes a place that becomes disenchanted, becomes viewed through this lens of science, and that we, and rationality, and that we lose sort of the mystery or that spiritual world itself. This is a cathedral built probably 1500, well, 1500s, I can't remember. I think this is in Sevilla, Spain. This may have been Barcelona. I actually think it's Barcelona. I think there a few years ago. I think this is the cathedral in Barcelona. Anyway, what's being illustrated here, this is prior to the development of science. This is the tallest building in a city, was a cathedral. Here's Qatar. This was built over a couple 100-year time period. This is Qatar. This tallest building today is in Qatar. And that building was less than 10 years, this major skyscraper, right? So this is an expression of a sacred world versus secular science, technology, business industry, shift in society itself. And this is where the interactionist component comes in, is for Weber, is empathic understanding. And empathic understanding gets us into language and understanding from viewpoint of other. And let's lead that into symbolic and interactionism. Interactionism is focused on language and symbols, perceptions, meaning, self-concept, identity. One way to think about interactionism is think about the response. Okay, so the outcome. Something happens between the stimulus and the outcome, and that's the interpretation. So as an example, marijuana, when marijuana was viewed as a drug that would cause murder, so a person's response, for example, not to use marijuana is a stimulus, response not used, there has to be an interpretation, and it's the reason for not using, right? So the belief is that interpretation that marijuana could cause this particular social problem. Or, for example, I think it was 1937, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was developed, the first government organization to address narcotics in the United States. We start to incarcerate marijuana menace. The criminalization of marijuana is in the 1930s. So our response is all based on interpretation. And the interactionist perspective is interested in that level of interpretation and ultimately the impact of that interpretation on response. So the meanings that we have things come out of a social context, historical, cultural, social context, and we're trying to understand those meanings. Cleveland Indians, Native American mascots. This is as you know, there's a lot of examination of the influence of Native American mascots, the critique of Native American mascots for sports teams, and interesting sort of discussions about and debate about mascots. This is a pretty powerful video. Proud to be a Native American, and sort of why, from a native point of view, of why mascots are problematic. Sports mascots are problematic. This is an editorial cartoon, just trying to shake things up, say, look, this is part of our culture maybe, but there's no way that these are based on stereotypes and ideas. There's no way that we would have these other sports mascots. Trying to take the taken for granted world, right? To use that term, this became part of culture. people weren't thinking about it more critically. This editorial cartoonist is trying to bring attention to it, to disrupt our meaning, to become more aware. Yeah, so sports teams, Washington Redskins changing the name, and they are changing their name, right? So after enough political pressure, social pressure, culture's changing, shifting, the way we think about sports mascots different today as a system. We can even go back to value consensus. In some ways, from a functionalist viewpoint, our values have shifted over a course of time. And so our symbols and representations are changing as well. Yeah, language around gender, super fascinating. Cisgender, cis male, cis female, bigender, agender, a lot of terminology is much more common today. It's a demonstration that things are shifting and moving in our culture. What meaning do we assign Walmart or Target, Target? It's language and construction of meaning. Words have an influence. The word illegal, alien versus undocumented versus unauthorized is a shift in thinking. It's not only just a shift in words, but it's a shift in thinking about how we think about members of a particular group and population. I was in it was a drugstore, just waiting in line. I looked over and I saw this lipstick and I was like, whoa, this is super fun. Thinking about lipstick and gendered ideas of lipstick. Unwrap me, all this like sexual kind of stuff, naughty and not nice, on the runway, on thin ice. It's like, this is so fun to look at. And there's even a class dimension, and maybe class dimension to the language. Things that are get a little bit more higher class is going to move away from this sort of sexualization kind of thing to caviar bar, Bordeaux, these kind of things. And I was trying to think about the equivalent for male, what products are males, and started thinking about, okay, so when condoms, then there's no. Well, there probably are colors. I'm not sure what they would be. It'd be interesting to know, are there color kind of stuff? What is the language around colors for condoms? I mean, because it gets into gender and culture stuff in a fascinating way. Strange and the familiar, right? Trojan, like, okay, where does that come from? That's definitely a masculine terminology, warrior, these kind of things. Anyway, that's part of the interactionist perspective, language, meaning, understanding, and its impact. And finally, I think it's important to identify, if you're interested in sociology, there's different things that you can do with a sociology degree. It could be working in mental health, working in human development and family services program at OSU Cascades, anything in the social sciences, preparing you for law school later on, working in public institutions, working in criminology, being a policy analysis, all these different areas that you can work in. There is a degree that's, you can think about it as applied sociology as a degree program. A more general umbrella that's at more colleges is public policy. If you're interested in being engaged and trying to understand, for example, the homelessness, affordable housing, these are public policy level stuff, and being involved in the discussions about those particular things. There's degree programs for that. Those are master's level programs in terms of public policies that have a career pathway to them. If you're interested and want to talk about those options, let me know. I'll be more than happy, to chat with you about, in my understanding, about those opportunities and availability to you. But I want you to become aware of that. Just be thinking about, these classes that you take, things that you find interested in. Chat with your professors. Maybe there's an educational and career opportunity down the road for something related to that, that grabs your interest. All right, a lot of information. Bring questions to class if you have them. The stuff that we went over, you're like, ooh, man, I'm kind of confused about that. What was that all about? Bring those questions forward. Always good, always helpful. If you have a question, and other people do as well. Look forward to seeing you in class. Have a great rest of your day.